Alright, you've all been very bad people, so it's time for you all to go to jail. Yes, we're talking about scary prisons today, as if any prison isn't scary, but more specifically though, we're talking about historical US prisons. Most of these are no longer in operation, so would you pay any of these places a visit? Let me know in the comments. With all that said, I'm James, and these are the top 10 terrifying American prisons from the 1800s. And we're starting off the list with Salisbury Prison in North Carolina. Salisbury Prison was a Confederate prison camp that began operation in 1861. First, the conditions in the prison weren't so bad. I mean, it was still a prison camp, so not an ideal place to spend your time, but not a complete nightmare either. There were roughly 120 Union soldiers housed there. They were fed decently and were given shelter, but that 120 inmates quickly grew to about 10,000 after only a few years. It comes as no surprise that the conditions at the camp severely dipped in quality. There was severe overcrowding. Many of them didn't have proper beds to sleep in. There wasn't enough food to feed everyone. Sanitation was bad. And this all led to the spread of disease and starvation. There was a high percentage of death amongst the prisoners. At number 9, we have Missouri State Penitentiary in Jefferson City, Missouri. This prison operated between 1836 and 2004, and for a long time it was the oldest operating prison west of the Mississippi River. Because of some of the gruesome stuff that went on here, this prison garnered quite the reputation of becoming known as the bloodiest 47 acres in America. The building still stands today, and it's said to be haunted by the former inmates who lost their lives within its walls. In the early days of the prison, neglect and mistreatment by guards was commonplace. Inmates were whipped, sometimes for no reason at all, as well as enduring far harsher forms of torture. A number of executions took place within the prison, and violent riots resulted in the loss of life on more than one occasion. One of the most infamous prisoners at Missouri State Pen was James Earl Ray, who managed to escape from the prison by hiding in a box used to ship bread. And just a year after making his escape, he would shoot down Martin Luther King. Next on the list is the Wyoming Territorial Prison. Beginning operation in 1873, this prison started off hot with a horrible fire within that very same year. Great start. Within only a few years, the prison became overcrowded. This meant poor conditions for the inmates and an increase in violence. Things leveled out, though, by the 1880s. Conditions were still harsh. However, the prisoners had to remain silent at all times. They were referred to simply as their designated number, and endured harsh physical and psychological punishment for breaking the rules. The most famous prisoner here was Butch Cassidy, the notorious train and bank robber and leader of the gang known as the Wild Bunch in the Old West. Today, there are a number of ghosts said to haunt the building, which now stands as a historical site, including that of a former cigar maker named Julius Greenwald. Greenwald had landed himself in prison after shooting his wife, having discovered her working in a brothel. But he was in the brothel, so he wasn't going there to see his wife. A little hypocritical, if I might say. Greenwald died while serving time at the prison, and his spirit is said to still be trapped within the building. Some visitors claim to smell a faint aroma of cigars wafting through the empty halls. Number 7, Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. Established in 1829, it was one of the first penitentiaries in the United States, designed to implement the revolutionary Pennsylvania system. This system focused on solitary confinement and reformation through reflection and labor, but the conditions within the penitentiary were far from ideal. Inmates were subjected to prolonged isolation, confined to small cells with minimal human interaction, and this lack of social contact often led to severe psychological and emotional deterioration among the prisoners. The penitentiary's architecture, designed by John Haviland, featured a hub and spoke layout where cell blocks radiated from a central surveillance hub. This made monitoring inmates easier, but also resulted in harsh living conditions. Over time, the poor conditions and the negative effects of solitary confinement on mental health became more evident, and isolation and lack of proper medical care contributed to a decline in the inmates' well-being. Despite efforts to improve conditions, the penitentiary struggled to address the physical and mental toll on its prisoners, and it closed its doors in 1971. At number 6, we have the Maxwell Street Police Station. This Chicago police station was built in 1888 in response to the increase in violence and crime in the neighborhood, but over time the police force became just as brutal as the criminals they were supposed to be protecting the neighborhood against, and stories started coming out about the horrors that inmates housed in the cells at the station would endure. Inmates endured grueling torture at the amusement of the officers, and the station soon gained a pretty bad reputation, receiving some very unsettling nicknames like the Old Red Fortress, Bloody Maxwell, and the wickedest police station in the world, just to name a few. Number 5, Sing Sing Correctional Facility in New York. The first prison on the list that's actually still in operation. The land for the prison was purchased in 1825 in Mount Pleasant on the banks of the Hudson River. 100 inmates were transferred from Auburn Prison to this piece of land where they would begin construction on their new home. It was constructed from marble from a nearby quarry, and the prison operated using the Auburn system, meaning prisoners were forced to remain silent at all times and worked through the day performing intense physical labor. If rules were broken, harsh physical punishment would be inflicted on the inmates. And Sing Sing Prison became famous for its death row, housing the infamous death house where between 1891 and 1963, 614 executions took place with the electric chair. Things are definitely a lot better for the prison nowadays though. Still a prison, so I wouldn't want to go, but at least they're allowed to talk now. Next up on the list is San Quentin State Prison. Beginning operation in 1854, this was and still is one of the most dangerous prisons in the United States. It houses the only death row in the state of California. Executions used to be carried out through the gas chamber, but are now done through lethal injection. During its early years, San Quentin housed prisoners in deplorable conditions. With overcrowding and unsanitary facilities, the prison garnered a reputation for brutality with reports of mistreatment, inmate violence, and harsh discipline. And the place has held some of the most notorious inmates in American history, like Charles Manson, and riots and violent incidents have erupted over the course of its operation. In at number 3, we have the West Virginia Penitentiary in Moundsville, West Virginia. With such a long and dark history, this place is known as one of the most haunted former prisons in the United States. Opening its doors in 1876, the prison operated for over a century before closing in 1995. Throughout its many years of operation, the penitentiary saw countless violent incidents, including riots and deadly clashes amongst inmates. The conditions were poor, often cramped and unsanitary, and the prison's most infamous feature was its use of the electric chair for executions, given the nickname Old Sparky, as well as hangings in its earlier days, which were often made public. With all the violence and death that took place within this ominous Gothic-style building during its operation, there are a number of reports of paranormal activity that have emerged over the years. The building still stands today and now has ghost tours with visitors and investigators reporting unsettling experiences during their visits. In at second place, we have Alcatraz. I'd put it at number 1, but this is a pretty heavily discussed haunted location, so I just thought that would be too obvious. I'm very cool because I'm a contrarian. Alcatraz, a rocky island located in San Francisco Bay, was first used for military purposes in the 1850s, housing soldiers and acting as a defensive stronghold. In 1934, it transitioned into a high-security prison, housing notorious criminals like Al Capone and George Machine Gun Kelly. Inmates here endured solitary confinement, demanding labor, and harsh punishment. Alcatraz gained a reputation for being an inescapable prison because of its isolated location and the frigid waters that surrounded it. Despite that though, there are several famous escape attempts from this prison, more so than most prisons to be honest, so I think they're kind of overcompensating with that. Over the years, a total of 14 escape attempts were made, with the 1962 attempt by Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers being probably the most famous. The escapees disappeared and were never found, and some say they actually may have made it to shore and were able to start a new life in secret. escaped. Others believe they might have drowned. Every other escape has been unsuccessful though, with prisoners being shot by guards while attempting to escape or just being caught before even making it that far. One prisoner in 1962, John Paul Scott, actually did manage to make it ashore, but he suffered from hypothermia and police found him unconscious. The building now stands as a museum, said to be haunted by the spirits of its former inmates. Visitors and staff claim to have experienced strange phenomena like hearing whispers in empty cells to even seeing full-on apparitions. And coming at number 1, we have Ohio Penitentiary in Columbus, Ohio. Yay, Ohio, my new favorite state. This penitentiary began operation in 1834, and just like every other institution on this list, its history is dark. It was home to hundreds of executions through hanging and the electric chair, but this place is probably most famous for a deadly fire that broke out in 1930. The fire was set off from a candle that ignited oily rags on the roof of the West Block, and it spread very quickly. Prisoners were pleading with guards to let them out of their cells, and some guards did help, but others just left them to burn. A group of prisoners managed to overpower a guard and retrieve his keys, using them to free other inmates, and pretty soon a massive riot started. Firefighters arrived on scene and were pelted with rocks for some reason. Fights broke out, and eventually the military was called in and the prison was completely surrounded. In the end, 322 inmates died, 230 were sent to the hospital, making this one of the deadliest fires/prison riots in North American history. With all that said, I have been your host James, and I'll catch you, yes you specifically, in the next video.